What we have found
Yeah.
is if we can get the carbohydrates below 140 grams per day, we can instantly begin to change those things. Blood triglycerides will come down immediately. Fasting blood glucose will stabilize. Insulin will come down. Loss of abdominal obesity. So all of those pre-diabetes syndromes will correct.
Having a really interesting discussion just before we started recording. So sir, any common man in India only consumes 0.6 to 0.7 gram per kg body weight of protein in his entire day. So sir, any common man, again, he only equates protein for bodybuilders, not for himself. Sir, you have 40 years of extensive clinical research experience in this domain. So sir, I am curious to hear what you have a say in this.
Yeah, the protein for muscle development is really critical, and we think the actual minimum level is about 1 gram per kg. You know, we want it higher for children. Obviously, while you're still growing, that's important. But just in the same way we think about bone health, it's important to realize that our muscle in our body is constantly turning over. We're constantly breaking it down and repairing it. And as we get older, that becomes less efficient. So protein in the diet is critical to allow the body to continue to repair itself. And, you know, if we don't, we tend to end up with more body fat and less muscle as we get older. And in terms of longevity, we know that as people begin to get to their 60s, their muscle health is a huge predictor of how well they're going to age into their 60s and 70s.
Don sir, you have a really interesting philosophy with muscle-centric nutrition or muscle-centric health. I am curious to know more about it.
So we do. My colleague and I, Dr. Gabrielle Lyon and I developed the concept of muscle-centric health. We think muscle is really sort of the foundation of health. It clearly is important for mobility, as you know, activities of daily life and getting around, but it's actually also where we handle blood glucose. It handles body lipids or fat blood levels. So issues of heart disease and diabetes are also related to muscle. India, I know, is developing a serious problem with diabetes right now. People aren't necessarily overweight, but they're somewhat under-muscled. And because of that, they simply can't handle carbohydrates. And as the diet changes, it becomes more westernized, I guess, in terms of processed foods. We're exposed to a lot of carbohydrates, a lot of high glycemic carbohydrates, and muscle is really the only way the body can handle it. So if our muscles aren't healthy, we tend to be moving toward that diabetes range, pre-diabetes, metabolic syndrome, and those types of things. So we think muscle-centric health is not only about mobility, you know, being able to move and do the things you want to do and need to do, but also how you protect your heart from blood lipids, how you protect your body from too much blood glucose. So we think muscle-centric health is the way everyone should think about how do I age well.
Sir, my immediate follow-up question for you is that India as a general is called diabetes capital of the world. So as a generally low protein content country, how that equates to insulin resistance spectrum of diseases?
So as you look at the diet macronutrients, you know, it's protein, carbohydrate, and fat. And so, you know, we would like to see protein for most people getting up around 100 grams per day. You know, in India, it's probably much closer to 40 or 50 grams per day.
Yeah.
And, you know, so when people get their protein too low, they tend to go to more and more carbohydrates. So now what you've done is distort the body's metabolism. You need higher and higher amounts of insulin to try and handle it. You're forcing the body to get rid of these carbohydrates. And so the body is metabolizing fats and carbohydrates and protein. And the reality is muscle actually prefers handling fats. Carbohydrates are very disruptive to body metabolism and also particularly to muscle metabolism. So that whole balance between carbohydrates and protein, when we're teaching it to adults, we always start with sort of a 1-to-1 ratio on protein and carbohydrates. My guess is in India, you're probably much closer to an 8-to-1 carbohydrate to protein ratio. And that is sort of that's sort of a prescription for diabetes, actually, that very high carbohydrate ratio. Bad for muscle, very difficult for the pancreas to handle with insulin. It's just a bad ratio.
So sir, let's say someone is a diabetes or pre-diabetes, or let's say he is an insulin resistance person, like he has a metabolic disarrangement like hypertriglyceridemia, hypercholesterolemia and other metabolic disorders. So sir, if you prescribe him high protein diet, then how he will benefit from it?
So we've dealt with a lot of patients and in our weight loss clinic and in our research, and basically in the United States, the average carbohydrate intake is almost 300 grams per day, and the average protein intake is around 75 to 80. So, higher protein than in India, but also probably higher total carbohydrate per day. So we have a bad ratio also. If you get people down to 130 grams of carbohydrates per day, you'll begin to correct a lot of those pre-diabetes and even diabetes syndrome things. We find that at the very least, people with diabetes can cut their medications at least in half if they just get their carbohydrates down.
Sir, is there anything called side effect or health risk of high protein intake? Because generally a common man presumes that if he takes high protein diet, then he will be at risk for uric acid or gout scenario, or as in a kidney stone or kidney damage, or thirdly as a liver damage or bone damage. Sir, so what's your take on this?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear the last sentence. Repeat what you just said again. I got the first part.
I will repeat it. So if someone consumes high protein diet, is there anything like side effect or health risk of the same?
Yeah. One of the first things to think about is what is considered the healthy range. Okay. The healthy range, you use the word high protein, so I think we need to figure out what is high. If the average intake in India is around 0.6 grams per kg, does that make 1 gram per kg high? It's higher. Okay, so if one looks at the National Academy of Science in the United States, our Institute of Medicine, we define a range for protein, and that healthy range, goes from 0.7, so above your level, 0.7 to 2.5 grams per kg.
Okay.
So that's a huge range. Where in that do I consider it becoming high? I think the research supports levels up to 1.8 grams per kg as normal. Okay, so I don't consider it high until above that. So that's 3 times the level in India. Are there any side effects? There are no known side effects to higher protein diets. People argue about gout. Gout is actually a metabolic error that has nothing to do with protein intake. It has to do with nucleic acid intake, and that is really only prevalent in a lot of organ meats. So if somebody eats a lot of liver, which no one in the United States does, but if someone eats a lot, that could have an effect, but the basic effect is still a metabolic error. You have an inborn error in your metabolism in your liver that you can't handle the uric acid, and so it accumulates. So gout has nothing to do with protein intake. If you have gout, you'll hear people say, well, you should lower your protein intake, but frankly, alcohol and carbohydrates are far worse issues than protein. Okay, so gout is totally a myth. The other 2 issues are bone health and kidney health. The origins of bone health is that if you go to a higher protein intake, you'll tend to see more calcium in the urine. And people said, well, that must mean we're losing bone. But it actually turns out that higher protein diets, you absorb more calcium. Typically in a diet, calcium that's in a diet, we only absorb it at around 30%, where if you have a higher protein diet, you'll absorb it at 45 or 50%. And so the fact that you're bringing more in, you'll also lose more in the urine. So the bone health, actually, protein is very important for bone health because the basic structure of bone is protein. Calcium, actually, minerals come in secondary. So first you have to build a matrix, which is all protein. And so, bone health long term is actually a protein thing. The third one is kidney renal disease. And where that comes from is people who have advanced renal failure, you have to get rid of solutes because the kidney can't process it. So whether that's salt or whether that's urea from protein, you have to lower those intakes. But what our Institute of Medicine showed is that actually low protein diets are more likely to cause kidney problems than high protein diets. It's actually exactly the opposite. One of the debates that's going on now is that if you actually have renal failure, say you have diabetes and your kidneys are failing, at what point should you reduce your protein? Stage 2, stage 3, stage 4, and that's an active debate. I personally think that in the early stages of kidney being compromised, lowering your protein intake actually reduces your kidney function. And so I think lowering it is a bad choice. So basically the myths that are out there or the issues of side effects of protein are really all myths. The only one that's sort of a secondary issue is people will say, well, higher protein diets correlate with more fat and more saturated fat and more calories. And for me in the United States, that's really a lifestyle choice. It's not people who are eating at home with good diets. It's people who are eating at fast foods and very unhealthy diet patterns. That to me is also a myth of epidemiology. Bad diets are bad diets and protein's kind of an irrelevant part of it.
दोस्तों ये वीडियो अगर आपको वैल्यूएबल लगा तो इसे लाइक कर अपने सारे दोस्तों से इसे शेयर कीजिएगा। इस चैनल को सब्सक्राइब तो आप कर ही लेंगे। चलिए मिलते हैं।